Hello, welcome to Disconnected. I ended up sitting here watching this whole video because I found this really interesting. And I've got a few little things to say about it. But let's quickly go over what it is. So there was a book written by Professor Nigel Biggar, Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology. With all due respect, but real morals... can they be taught? I think we have a moral compass in us, and we have that, and that's it. Being taught, especially if you come from a theology past. Pastoral theology, I don't know if that means... And the canon of Christ... Oh, fuck, it's a fucking Christian bastard. Oh, my God. Here we go. Okay, no wonder. All right, so anyway... I apologize. I take all that back. And the book is called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Provides a new assessment of the West's colonial record. How I ended up on this video was actually watching a African-American lady being in awe about a video about somebody else made about how amazing Britain was for... kind of destroying the slave trade in the early 1800s, and as if it's some sort of impressive feat. Obviously, it's a good thing that they did, and it's also wonderful, and if they didn't, it probably would have lasted much longer, absolutely. But the problem with this whole argument lies in the sense that... It basically tries to paint the British colonies and British colonization and imperialism as some sort of force for good, and I think this video is then recommended as and then obviously this person, Mr. Nigel Biggar, Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford and Canon of Christ Church Cathedral. Honestly, a professor in morality? Seriously? Anyway, let's go for it.
Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, before I introduce my guest this week, just a polite reminder, please do subscribe, won't you? Our subscriptions have been going up and up and up recently, but we don't want to be complacent about it. So please do. It's totally free, as you must know by now. And once you've done that, if you go next door, you'll see there's another little Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. It's already a bestseller. I couldn't recommend it more, saying that perhaps imperialism and the British Empire in particular were not necessarily all motivated by evil. What I want to start by asking you, actually, is that at the very beginning, you talk about why you wanted to write this book. I'm just going to read it if I can. I think it's very good. We're talking about the current time. What is at stake at the moment is not merely the pedantic truth about yesterday, but the self-perception and self-confidence of the British today and the way they conduct themselves in the world tomorrow. What is also at stake, therefore, is the very integrity of the United Kingdom and the security of the West. That is why I have written this book. Now, that seems to be a noble motive. Can you expand on that?
Yes, there were two stimuli for my writing the book in the first place. I'm both English and Scottish. I was born in Scotland, educated in England. I identify myself as British, so I'm committed to the United Kingdom and keeping the UK united.
Oh my God, this shit triggers me all the way to the moon and hell and back. So, if you're born in Scotland and you are Scottish, then you're Scottish. And I don't mean this because of kind of a nationalistic view or like being over pedantic, because if somebody moves to another country and they really like that country, they can, and they want to take up that nationality of another country, that's fine. I mean, you can immigrate and do all these things. But for me personally, having lived in this country for such a long time now, I find it very strange that if you are Scottish, that you would want to identify as British, or you're happy to be in both countries because of the absolute inequality between the two countries, and that Scotland absolutely 100% for every intents and purposes is one of the last remaining colonies of England, end of story, no matter which way you cut it. We have a devolved government which has pathetic powers, just enough for them to be blamed for everything and not enough to actually make a difference. Life quality here is less than down south. Now I'm gonna obviously it's the same if you live in the north of England too. They're also basically disregarded. So unless you live in London, you've got a job in finance, or you're buddy with a landowner, you're kind of screwed in this godforsaken place. So to me, the logic of anybody who is Scottish, who feels British, other than by force, makes me wonder about their about what they see in this country and their perspective that they see the British Isles with. Right, the UK is definitely not a place where you can say, well, if I'm Welsh, if I live in Wales or I live in Scotland, I have some sort of equal say, equal opportunities, or anything like that the UK is supposedly proposes. And that is why people like me and many others are 100% for Scottish independence. There's also another problem, is that the overall feeling in Scotland and the whole direction that Scotland wants to take, the whole mindset is absolutely different from England. And anecdotally, at least, and from my point of view on what I've seen and heard, it is the same for the north of England. Anyway, so that's my first trigger.
So I've always been an opponent of Scottish separatism, and I noticed
Scottish separatism. That's an ugly word for saying Scotland just wants to be independent. Like pretty much every other country in the world is independent, but it's somehow an ugly word when Scotland wants to do it. Then they're separatists, and they use all these terms which just make it sound awful and negative, rather than just going like, well, pretty much every other country is independent. We would like to be independent too. Thank you very much. Oh my God, you're separatists. It's just insane way of thinking.
When reading certain Scottish nationalists in and around the 2014 referendum, that some of them thought of or think of Scottish separation from the UK, Scottish independence, as a kind of national self-purification of Scotland from Britain, and Britain equals empire equals evil.
Yeah, but that's not because we know that during all the way from this, well, during the whole colonial era, there were enough wealthy Scottish landowners, businessmen who made just as much money from the colonies and were deeply embedded into the whole colonizing and slavery problem. So I don't think that he might have gotten that sense, but I think that most people who want independence just want independence. They don't want to be part of the British mindset, the kind of legacy imperial mindset. Look, we still have a queen, we still have rich landowners running around. I mean, we do have the same here, but that's a legacy, right? And even Scotland it wants to push through certain land reforms to kind of break that down a little bit. The mentality is completely different. And trying to say that Scotland wants independence because they don't want to be associated with the past colonization issues that Britain had is a bit far-fetched.
And so my contribution to combating the feelings that generate support for Scottish independence was to push back against that travesty of Britain's imperial history, and that's why one reason I wrote that book. But
so basically, to support the Unionists, he wants to play down colonialism and the effects of colonialism. That's basically what he said.
More generally, I observe that, as is evident, and you'll know this, at the moment, although there's much talk about empire and colonialism, no one cares about the Arab empires of the medieval period, or African empires, the Zulu Empire or the Comanche Empire in the southwest of North America, or the Chinese Empire. No one cares about non-white empires or non.
That's entirely untrue. We are talking about British colonialism because that is the most obvious and current to our situation. Why would we talk about the Roman Empire that happened, that ended in, what was it, 400 AD or something, right? We're talking about the colonialism and the effects of colonialism, and the effects of colonialism to this day on the economies of many countries, of the people of many countries, the ownership of land, of businesses, of natural resources, to this day. Now, obviously, there are other places where that has also still had an effect to this day, but we are not talking about this because we don't care. We're talking about because we live in Britain, and it is our daily experience.
European empires. So what's the obsession? Why the obsession with European empires, and especially the British? And it's my reading is this is an assault on the record of the West.
So it's almost by proxy. So this kind of assault on the empire academically is actually really about the West today.
Yes, and it's
funny how anybody who is against Westernism and capitalism or extreme capitalism or against colonialism is suddenly painted as if they hate the West. We just want it to be fairer and better. We don't hate it.
It's our equivalent of the assault on the foundations of the United States. So in the United States, there is this 1619 project, whose claim is that the very foundations of the United States are racist, and therefore the American project is from the beginning morally vicious and illegitimate. So
it is what. Have you not been paying attention? That's exactly what it is. Oh, Jesus, theologian.
So the debate over colonialism here is our equivalent to that.
Are you surprised? I mean, why do you think this has sort of blown up in the past, 3 years? I'm not saying there hasn't always been this narrative, but in the past 3 years, particularly in America, with the 1619 project, as you just mentioned,
yes,
it's gone at this extraordinary speed, it seems to me. Why?
So two things. I think social media, of course, brings ideas from the margins to the centre very quickly, and they just spread. And insofar as institutions care about what goes on social media, these movements that expand through social media can become quite powerful. So there's that. But the other thing is, we had the adumbration, the kind of the heralding of the current mood when the Rose Must Fall campaign arrived in Britain from South Africa in 2015-16. And then what happened was the killing of George Floyd in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was an American movement, suddenly landed over here, and various activist groups on the left promoted it as if the UK were the US. So it's as if whatever problems the US suffers from in terms of race and in terms of their fundamentally racist society is equally true of us.
I guess on the surface of it, anecdotally looking at the two countries, you can't really say it's the same. You can't really say, well, racism in the UK is the same as a certain obvious racist things happening in the US. The UK doesn't. Well, no, they do actually. We've got the BNP. we had UKIP. We had political parties specifically there to try and make sure that white people are put forward. But there's more to it. The problem with racism is, especially nowadays, is that it's so kind of hidden. You don't see it. It is more the attitudes of people. It becomes a little bit less tangible because you don't have these obvious racist people running around being racist. It is more kind of subjective, kind of. I don't think the kind of overall racism is that different, just because we don't have as many cops killing black kids, which we also have, doesn't mean we're necessarily less racist. I tend to think that people in the UK are not racist until they need to be, if that makes any sense. So here people are all happy and clappy and think everything is fine until you're faced with a decision, whether it be against refugees, Muslim community, blacks, black people in the UK, etc. It only happens when a decision needs to be made, when they're confronted with something, that there's probably this underlying decision making which favors one race over the other. And so to say that we're not the same, I don't think is fair, and I don't think we're as bad, but I don't think we're that different in the UK at all. There's also one thing that everybody always forgets, and you don't notice that unless you are on the receiving end of colonialism or racism, is that Britain, up to this day, is a master at PR. The way that they can manipulate a situation to not look as bad. I'll give you an example. It's always been, so well known that Africa is so horrendously corrupt, the governments. But if you look back now at the last 5-6 years, basically since the Tories came into power, so there's always been corruption in the UK. The difference was that the corruption in the UK amongst our politicians was so clever and nepotistic and so well PR'd and covered up that the majority of people don't really realize it until they feel the effects of it directly, whereas the corrupt governments in other countries, Africa, maybe South America, etc., were just open and blatant about it. So, yeah, we'll figure out what you're going to do about it, kind of thing. But it's shifted now because you can, if anybody's been paying any attention how horrifically corrupt our government has been for the last at least 5 years, with everything that came out with Boris Johnson and PPE and the, putting people into the Lords and where all the money went, billions and billions of pounds. The UK government is just as corrupt, probably even more so at this point in time. Why I'm saying this is because the way that Britain and the British deal with these sort of things is just much more kind of subdued and underlying. It is not so blatant and upfront, and that is why it feels, I think, that's why it feels as if we're not as racist in the UK, or the UK is not as racist, systemically racist as other countries. But all you have to do is go and look at the Windrush scandals and all these things to see, well, it's bullshit. We in the UK does exactly the same horrible things. So
if you put together social media, the political interest of activist groups exploiting Black Lives Matter, combined with widespread ignorance, even among educated, degree-holding citizens in Britain, people who run institutions, widespread ignorance of our imperial history. No one knows enough to contradict the radically negative narrative, and that's.
See, this is the thing. When it comes to colonialism, it's one of those things where you don't have to be a scholar of history to know about colonialism. Just the basic information is already enough to give you an absolute clear picture. So Britain did colonize, what was it, a third of the world. They took over countless countries. They enslaved people. Then they made massive amount of fortunes in those countries and brought it back home. Then they abolished slavery and were instrumental at it. And then for the next, until 1940s, 1960s even, they massively benefited from those colonies. And the trickle of countries becoming independent was quite slow. If you think about South Africa, for example, only became independent in the 60s. So this is fairly recent history. This is not like 10,000 years ago history. This is recent history. And on top of that, you have, even with those countries having been become independent, by that time they've already been stripped of their wealth. They've already been, the majority of the resources that are being mined or used or farmed were, and some of it's still owned by legacy British people or white people. The cities like Glasgow, like Stirling, Liverpool, Newcastle, Birmingham, you name it, how many cities are the way they are because literally the money that was made through the slave trade and then later on the colonies. The fact that Britain had even half a decent force in both the world wars was because they could tap into South African troops, Indian troops, troops from all over the world that they had colonized. As if Britain itself is powerful. No, it was because they had all these colonies. So you don't need to know absolutely everything. You just have to look at the state today, the beers, the diamonds, coffee beans, chocolate, you name it. It's insane the amount that is still kind of a legacy from colonization. So obviously you don't need to know absolutely everything about the subject to even to this day know exactly the benefits that Britain has yielded from the colonies and how poor those colonies are still to this day because of that stripping of resources and people.
One reason I wrote the book, at least, if no one agrees with my argument, at least in the pages of my book they will discover the whole truth, the good and the bad and the good about our imperial past.
You see, that seems to be key to me, that in fact, people just simply don't know. They don't know the facts, they don't know, even if they want to, come to a conclusion which is not the same as mine or yours or whatever, they simply don't know the facts. And you do come across people now, younger people particularly, who seriously think that slavery was a uniquely British thing, for example.
Yes.
That even colonialism was a British thing. Because although the British Empire features in your book, it's actually about imperialism, isn't it, generally? I'm intrigued, the title is A Moral Reckoning, and that ethics is your field, isn't it? So
That's
how
right.
does that differ from being an historical reckoning?
Right, so as you say, I'm an ethicist, so I'm in the business.
How I don't know what to say to that. He's an ethicist, a professor of morality. What is that? How can you? That's like, I don't know, people who do study some weird shit in university. I mean, we all have morals. Thank you very much. We don't need somebody to study and then tell us about morals.
Business of analysing issues and coming to a moral judgment about them. That's my trade, that's my profession. And so what I've tried to do is to, in the course of my career I have worked on the ethics of war, for example, so I've tried to come to judgments about various wars, present and past.
Dude, we all do that. We don't need to go study to have some sort of moral compass. What the hell?
And so I tried something more ambitious here to reach a moral judgment, an overall moral judgment about the phenomenon of empire and the particular phenomenon of one empire, namely the British. Now, lots of my critics, particularly on the far left, point out that Biggar is not an historian, and so Biggar really has no authority to speak about these matters. To which my swift response.
So, I don't necessarily agree with that. If he did good research, I don't have a problem with that. But it's the next line which I find hilarious, because he thinks he's got like a mic drop on him.
Response is, well, no, and you're not ethicists, and yet apparently you've got.
It's because you don't need to study ethics. It's like a normal human trait. Ethics. Everybody has had it in some shape or form. And I don't think anybody can teach you ethics. Sorry, where was I? That's the postman, and the dog absolutely adores the postman. Not. Anyway, so obviously you can teach ethics. It comes from our society, our parents, our schools, our society. But somebody studying it and then wanting to force it down your throat, forget about it.
Got very strong moral views about the past. The book is organised. It's not a history of the British Empire. It's organised according to moral issues like racism and violence and economic issues and cultural assimilation, that kind of thing. So it's organised in terms of moral issue. But obviously, I have to try and get the historical facts straight, so I know what I'm judging, and so I've taken care, particularly when dealing with issues I know are controversial, to read more than one historian, and as you'll see at the beginning of the book, there are about 10 pre-publication commendations by historians, so many professional historians reckon I've done a decent job, although I'm quite sure that given the vastness of the territory in terms of geographical extent from British Columbia to New Zealand, and in terms of time from 1600 to 1960, there will be mistakes in there. But several historians who've read the text reckon it's a pretty balanced and fair judgment.
I've never seen so many notes, actually, I have to say. It's going on for pages.
I had to cover my rear end. But I decided to spare the reader some of my skirmishes with my critics.
Right.
But there's some good stuff in the notes.
Actually, speaking of your skirmishes with critics, in some ways, you sort of found is it right to say, actually, you sort of found yourself in this position? Because you wrote a piece, didn't you, for the Times? This would have been 2015, I think?
17.
17?
Yep.
So, basically before the Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Talking about how, look, it's a more nuanced picture. There was good and bad in everything, and that includes the British Empire. And basically the roof came down on you, didn't it?
That's right. So this was December 17. In July of that year, I'd launched a research project called Ethics and Empire, which was designed to look at empires from ancient China to the modern period and look at how contemporaries viewed empire in moral terms. So this was nothing to do with defending British Empire. But then, you're right, in November of 2017 I published an article in the Times arguing that we British can find cause for both shame and pride in our imperial past. And it was a week or two later that Dr. Priyamvada Gopal from Cambridge University tweeted to her allies, her political allies in Oxford, OMG, oh my God, this is serious, SHIT, we must, block capitals, shut this down, is what she tweeted.
Gopal?
Gopal, yeah.
So, if anybody's listened to any of the things that I've said, you should never shut anybody down. Free speech is free speech. The idea of trying to find the good and the bad in the colonial history, I find good, and I'm glad he did it. I'm not actually criticizing his book, and I've not read it, but I'm also not going to read it. I'm just commenting on the things that are being said here. The only thing I would like to say is, maybe he found some positive things to say about colonialism. But the positive things that I've heard about colonialism, about British colonialism, to this date, has all been about they brought civility to certain countries, they built railroads in certain countries, they built up infrastructure in certain countries, they put schools together in certain countries. What people forget, because it sounds all good and well, at the same time, though, they were basically depleting that country of everything else and making themselves filthy rich. The second piece is like, those countries didn't ask you to come and do it, right? They just didn't. So just because you do something good for somebody doesn't mean they actually asked for it or needed it or wanted it. A lot of these countries were perfectly happy the way they are. Because remember, happiness is whatever happiness is. The criticism of the West has always been, look, okay, you brought, I don't know, money and modern stuff and, you know, railways and manufacturing and whatever, but we were happy. We didn't need it. We were fine. We were cool, right? So it was like imposing the West's idea of happiness and wealth and stability and all these things onto another country. And then when you got that for the other country, then you went, you see, we helped you. But nobody asked for it. Nobody knows if they would have been any better off or worse off hadn't that happened. So if that's the argument, I would counter that. Definitely, you know, if they went into a country where people were literally still hunter-gatherers and then suddenly built them houses and made them work in factories where they got money and they could then, you know, after 50 years drive a car, it doesn't really necessarily make their life better. It makes their life different. It doesn't necessarily make them happier. That is not something that you can say. And that's the argument that you always get, like, oh, look what we did in India. Yeah, we killed, I don't know, millions of people, but, you know, we built railways. You know, you also created borders where there shouldn't have been and wars that last to this day. But never mind. So I'm really interested to see what he finds positive in British colonialism. But I'm definitely not going to read the book. The fact that it's written by a professor of moral and pastoral theology. Fair enough, it doesn't mean he doesn't know what he's talking about, but it's still like, what kind of person needs to study morality? Yeah, never mind. Thank you very much.